City of Stevens Point Finance Committee meeting, recorded July 10, 2023.
All right, 6:33, we'll call the meeting of the Finance Committee to order. Please take roll.
Christensen.
Here.
Morrow.
Here.
Shore.
Here.
Zarazua.
Here.
Shuda.
Here.
Okay, on this evening's agenda, first of all, we have a couple of non-action items. Presentation of a 2022 audit report by Baker Tilly.
Yes, so the auditors are present via Zoom. We have Carla Gogan, who handles the city side of the audit, and then we also have Jody Dobson, who handles the utility side of the audit. So they're both here today to give us an update on how the audit went and the overall financial condition of the city and our overall financial performance for 2022.
Good evening, and thank you, Corey, for the introduction. I assume you can hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, thank you. And this year, I understand the city will share its screen and advance the materials for us. You can just stay on the first page here for a moment, and I'll let you know when you can move on to the next page.
Okay.
As Corey mentioned, I am Carla Gogan. I am responsible for the city portion of the audit and will cover content related to the governmental funds today. Then I will turn it over to Jody. She will cover the utility aspects of the financial audit. And I do, just by way of introduction, also want to mention that Taylor Vagali is on the line with us today. Taylor is the city's audit in charge, so she'll just be listening in this evening. I'd like to start by thanking the finance team. We worked closely with Corey, Matthew, and Carrie, as well as others throughout the city, and want to thank them for their cooperation and their readiness as we worked through the city portion of the audit. We issued a number of deliverables. What I will talk through tonight are the financial highlights, but we've also issued the financial statements for the city and the various utility funds. We also issued a reporting and insights document. I will pause periodically throughout tonight's meeting just to see if you do have any questions or comments as we go through the content. One thing I do want to mention is that we did issue an unmodified or a clean audit opinion. That is the highest level of assurance that you can receive on your financial audit. It's what you've received in the past, and it's what you should expect to receive. We executed on our financial audit as planned, so we established our plan, and really there wasn't anything that caused us to deviate from our audit plan. So with that, I will have you move on to the next page, which is the general fund results. So perfect. And so, as I mentioned, I will focus on the governmental funds of the city. The governmental funds, and in particular, the general fund. The general fund is the main operating fund of the city. It's where you have the activities for public works. You were talking about public works activities earlier. The fire chief was just in. This also includes public safety activity. And it's a good indicator of the fiscal health of a community. And so I will go through that, and then I will cover some information on debt service activity, and then I will turn it over to Jody. But first, as you see here on the page, we'll stay here for a moment, you'll see the total general fund balance of the general fund. And you'll see the black line is 2021, the blue is 2022. You'll see that fund balance did go down by about $1.8 million. And I'll have you stay right here on the page. In a moment, I'll have you scroll down, but that was planned. The city had approved a budget for 2022 to actually reduce fund balance in the general fund by about $2 million. And so you actually came in better than what you had budgeted. And as we walk down the different categories of fund balance, it's really what tells the story. So unassigned fund balance stayed essentially even. It did go up by $331. So essentially stayed flat. And your unassigned fund balance are funds that do not have strings attached to it. It gives you a great deal of flexibility in terms of how you want to apply those funds or save those funds for future purposes down the road. Your assigned fund balance, the next category, that went down by approximately $300,000. And that's because what's included in this category represents monies that are assigned to the next year's budget. So in this case, at the end of 2022, the monies that were assigned for 2023 went down by about $300,000 compared to what had been assigned the prior year for that use of fund balance. The city did not have any committed funds at the end of 21 or 22. And then your restricted funds went up slightly, and that had to do with donations. So anytime if you're receiving donations and those monies are not spent by year end, those monies are restricted for other purposes. And that is why it would be shown as restricted. The most significant shift in fund balance is in the non-spendable category, and that went down by about $1.6 million. Non-spendable funds are funds that are not readily available. They're not liquid in nature. In this case, the most significant portion has to do with long-term receivables related to loans or advances that the general fund is making to other funds. And over the years, as I've been presenting these results, the city has had an advance to TIF number 6. TIF number 6 continues to pay that advance off. And so the significant decrease really is because of TIF 6 having the funds to be able to pay those funds off. So that non-spendable piece has gone down. So now I will have you scroll down a bit on the page to the summarized income statement. On this particular page, as I mentioned earlier, you can see here that in the middle, the final budget, you had budgeted to reduce fund balance by $2 million. Again, you reduced fund balance by just under $1.9 million. So you did have a positive variance for the year. I will have you advance to the next page, or page number 2. And when I get to the end of page 2, I will pause if there are any questions or comments. On this page, we take a look at the fund balance policy that the city has. And it's always very good to have a fund balance policy. It's what you as a governing body can hold management accountable to, and it's what management can manage the results to. And so the narrative above explains what the fund balance policy is of the city. And then the graph below is intended to show that. So your policy maximum is the black line, which is a maximum of 6 months of the next year's budgeted expenditures. So in this case, that'd be your 2023 budgeted expenditures in the general fund. And then the minimum is the blue line, which represents 4 months, or about 33%. And then the red line is the actual results. So you can see that except for 1 year where you went over the maximum, and if you're going to go over or under your policy, that's the direction to go. But you're at essentially 96% of the maximum amount. So very strong fund balance results for the city. You've continued to manage your fund balance very well. Before I have you move on to the next page, where I'm going to shift gears and talk about the debt position of the city, are there any questions or comments at this time regarding the fund balance or the general fund position?
Doesn't look like it. I think you can proceed.
Okay, thank you. So I'll have you move on then to the next page, where we'll talk about debt management for the city. So the debt of the city, what is represented on this graph is the top line, the black line, represents the GO debt capacity or debt limit of the city. And the city, along with all governments, is limited to 5% of its equalized value is the GO debt limit. And GO debt, this is your general obligation debt. And general obligation debt is secured by the taxing authority of the city. And so your GO debt capacity or your debt limit has gone up by 37% over the last 5 years. So strong and steady growth in equalized value, which again provides flexibility to the city. How the city pays for projects is by tax levy, charges for services, grant dollars, and ultimately debt proceeds for long-lived assets. And then tax levy is used to pay this off. You'll see the red line represents the GO debt outstanding for the city, so that the difference between the two is it represents unused debt capacity. At the end of the year, you're at 26% of your debt limit. Very positive, considering you have 9 active TIF districts, as well as just other capital projects as it relates to street projects and other large capital items. So I'll have you stay on this page and just scroll down a bit, where it does show the total debt outstanding by type for 2022. And this just shows you that the general obligation debt is primarily related to city activities. The utilities do have some, but a very minimal amount of the GO debt. And then as you go over to the next column, you'll see that the utilities have revenue bonds outstanding. And Jody will talk about the different enterprise funds and how it relates to the revenue debt outstanding. Revenue is secured by the charges for services that the utilities charge, whereas, as I mentioned, GO debt is related to or is secured by the taxing authority. So I'll have you move on to the next page, page 4, and then I will pause after the graphic on page 4, again, if there are any questions. But this just takes a look at, as you look at your spend in terms of your debt service to non-capital expenditures, you spend around 20% of your essentially non-capital costs over all funds, governmental funds, about 21% on debt service. So that's a very healthy metric, and it's stayed fairly consistent over the years, over the last 5 years. I'll have you scroll down a little bit on the page where it just shows current and prior year data. Again, just shows the principal and interest payments, and then your total, your non-capital expenditures and how that relates. We do remove capital out of this because capital will fluctuate greatly from year to year depending on where you are, in relation to your capital projects. So I'll pause there before I move to the next page, which is related to the TIF district. So I'll just spend a moment on that, and then I will be turning it over to Jody. But any questions as it relates to the city's debt position?
It looks like we do have a question.
Okay.
Come to the podium, please.
I noticed the trend on that graph is it continues up, up, up. This is the first year we've come down. I was wondering if you could explain what's going on. Why does it come down?
And, ultimately, I likely will, I'll have you move back up on the page and to the page before, page 5. So I think you're referring to, was at 17.3%, it went up to 24%, 21%, and then it has come back down. Are you speaking of, I think if you scroll down a page, I think that's what you're referring to. So if you want to go down to the graphic
that would
there.
be the graph that I'm referring to. Why does the trend break and we start to decrease? Is there an explanation for that?
Yeah, I can answer that. That's related to, because I believe this graph also includes TIF district debt payments as well, so it's our total payments in terms of the debt that we pay for with tax levy, as well as the debt that's paid for with TIF districts. And there was a TIF district borrowing that has dwindled down a little bit, so the payments related to TIF district debt reduced for 2022.
Thank you, Corey. Any other questions?
We look good?
Okay. Then I will have you scroll down to the next page, which is the TIF district highlights. This is just at a very high level. As I mentioned, the city has 9 active TIF districts. And you'll see the third line down is your fund balance in each TIF district. This is, this would represent all funds that have come in, all revenue sources, less all expenditures in those TIF districts. To the extent there are deficits, then typically there are interfund loans, typically with the general fund, to assist the TIF districts in times when they are operating at a deficit. The next row down, it really shows you what is still recoverable through TIF increments through 12/31/22. So this is going to be ultimately what you are looking to, as of 12/31/22, what you are looking to recover in TIF increment to pay for its costs. And so, as you can see then down below, the last date to collect increment, these TIF districts, have still quite a long life. TIF 7 closes in 5 years, TIF 8 in 7 years, but then it goes on to 9 years, 10 years, and your most recent 4 TIF districts, 10 through 13, still have a 24-year life. These are economic development tools, and they purposefully have a long life in order to recover the costs associated with their activity. And as Corey mentioned, the intention is that the debt that is borrowed, which is GO debt, that ultimately it is the TIF increment that pays for the debt service related to the TIF districts. So activity here as I would expect. At this point, I will pause if there are any questions related to TIF or anything else that is city related. Otherwise, then if there are no questions, we will move on to the utility results, and I'll turn it over to Jody Dobson, but I'll pause here for a moment in case there are any questions or comments related to TIF.
Yeah, I do have one comment. For TIF 6, there was a time where we had a $6 million advance to TIF 6, where it was in the hole by $6 million. Now you look at this for 2022, I think we really crossed a big milestone where that advance is less than $1 million. And for 2023, we plan to close out that advance completely. So I think that certainly is a big accomplishment for the city. There was a time where we didn't think we'd ever get out from under that TIF advance, where we thought we were going to be closing that TIF district in the red. So to see how far that's come along is certainly something that I think we can all be proud of.
Well, and it's important to note, too, for some of the alders that haven't been around quite as long, most of that debt was incurred in relation to the mall, the tearing down of the mall, the Lullaby site. Those are the biggies that really kind of got us upside down there. We lowered our value by tearing stuff down.
Thank you, Corey. I think that is very important to note. And it's one of the reasons why TIFs have a long life, to give communities the opportunity to recover. And so this definitely is a success story for the city. Okay, with that, I'm going to put myself on mute, and then I'll turn it over to Jody Dobson. You can move on to the next page, and she will start with covering the water utility results.
Thank you very much, Carla. So what I'd like to do here is walk through each of the utilities of the key enterprise funds that the city has. As we work with Carla's team to complete the audit, we also issue some standalone reports here, and those were presented earlier today for the utilities. So starting with the water utility, as we see that top number, the rate of return, that's a key benchmark that the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin uses to measure the health of a water utility as they're setting the rates. So the water utility had new rates that went into effect, I believe, in December of 2021. So we really saw the impact of those in 2022. And that's where we see that increase in revenues in the table below, resulting in the increase in the rate of return. So that's the amount that the utility is earning on its investment in capital. As we look then at the bottom half of the page, we have two other key metrics that we look at for each utility. The first is the unrestricted cash reserves. The Government Finance Officers Association would say a minimum of 3 months worth of operations and cash reserves for an enterprise fund utility. I know rating agencies look for closer to 6 to 9 months. So that's what we look for here and kind of see the trend. So number one, at the end of 2022, the water utility had very strong reserves at just over 6 months. But also as we look at that 5-year trend, while there are some ups and downs as capital projects may come and go, overall a very stable dollar amount. And so that's positive. Carla also mentioned that the utilities have revenue bonds outstanding. So one of the conditions of a revenue bond is typically that there is a debt coverage ratio, meaning the utility is required to have rates set such that they're earning enough to pay their operating costs and their debt service, their principal and interest, plus a coverage. So in the case of the water utility, they're required to have their revenues cover at least 1.1 times their principal and interest. It actually, after covering operating expenses, that net amount covered 3.5 times. So very strong there. And again, we see a very consistent trend. And then the last benchmark here that we look at is how much of the investment in capital infrastructure is financed through equity or outstanding debt. And for the water utility, it's only about 15% of outstanding debt. So that's a relatively small amount. I would say if you look at the grand scheme of all utilities out there, 50-50 is probably a reasonable benchmark. So if we go to the next page, we have similar information for the sewer utility. We don't have a rate of return because the rates here are not regulated by the state agency, so that's unique to the water utility. But we can see that the operating revenues have consistently exceeded the operating expenses, and for the last 3 years, that margin has been very stable. The impact here on the unrestricted reserves is they've been, for the last 3 years, a little bit of an up and down there, but we were a little over 2 months at year end. And that's in part due to some spend down per capital items that's anticipated. When we look at the debt coverage for the sewer utility, it's at 1.7 compared to the required of 1.25. I do want to note here, you'll see those different requirements between the utilities. That really is based on where the borrowing comes from. Some of the state programs, so the Clean Water Fund loans or Safe Drinking Water loans, typically have the 1.1 coverage requirement. Oftentimes we see 1.2 or 1.25 when you're looking at bonds issued in the market. So it's just where that source is. And then looking at the bar at the bottom, so here the sewer utility does have more of their infrastructure financed with outstanding debt, but with some of the recent upgrades at the treatment plant, which are a significant investment, that's not surprising. The next page looks at the stormwater utility. So if we scroll down, very similar information here to think about. The operating results, we do have a bit of a crossover period if we go back in time, but for the last 3 years have been seeing operating income and relatively stable margins. They decreased a little bit in 2022. This was actually talked about earlier today, and that crossover had to do with some significant projects that were going on in the early years on this graph that have been adjusted through rates over time. But then looking at that narrowing of the margin in 2022 did have some impacts on 2022. So as we go down to the bottom, The cash reserves for the stormwater utility are still very strong with almost 10 months on hand at year end. And so that's been built up to a good point. But those current year returns or results did impact the debt coverage for 2022 with that increase in expenses. And so because that was close, I understand that you've already addressed that with some rate adjustments in 2023 so that that won't become a concern. And then again here, only about 20% of the infrastructure financed with outstanding debt. So relatively small amount. So the next page, we're going to move to the airport, and we do look at things a little bit differently here because the airport funding structure is a little bit different. But as we look at the operating revenues for the airport, we can see that the last 2 years have been very consistent, both in the total revenues coming in as well as the mix of operating revenues and city or other subsidies. This has improved from 2020, but not quite back to the 2019 levels for activity there. And then as we look at the expenses on the lower half, we can see the operating and maintenance costs, or the black section of those bars. Again, decreased in 2020 as anticipated with the change in operations, has come back up a little bit. And then the pale green part there is the depreciation expense. And so that did increase in 2022 just with some newer investments in capital infrastructure and with some older items that had been removed over time. And then looking at the unrestricted cash reserves for the airport at the bottom of the page, almost 6 months on hand. So very strong there. And looking at the dollar amount, relatively stable. The next page has the transit organization. So here looking at the operating revenues, we have a few more items in the mix. What stands out to me here is that in 2021, we had some unique federal subsidies that were available that were applied by the transit or utilized before they expired. And so that increased that orange section a little bit. And so as those reverted back to more normal levels in 2022, then we see the increase of the state aid coming back in there. And that was fairly consistent across the industry with some of the specific pandemic funding that came to transit agencies. And then looking at the bottom half, we look at the expenses. We see a relatively consistent mix here with the largest expense for the transit operations being in salaries and benefits, very labor intensive. And that again is consistent with all of the transit organizations that we work with. And the last item we have is the fiber, which is your newest utility. So we only have 3 years worth of information to look at. But what we can see here is that as operations have ramped up and settled in by year 3 here, we have a significant improvement where our revenues are outpacing our expenses on an annual basis. So that's very positive, and that's allowed the utility to build up a very strong cash reserve. And for a newer utility like this to have that larger cash reserve for something unexpected is really helpful. And at this point, there's been no debt issued for the fiber utility.
That's it.
And I think that's all.
It is. Are there any questions related to the enterprise funds or the utility funds for Jody or management?
Any questions from the committee? Any questions from the public? Okay. Thank you for all the information.
You have to come up to the
Podium,
lectern.
please.
Dave Iden, 1008 Matilda Street. What does the fiber utility represent? I'm just curious.
So it's a community area network. We put in fiber infrastructure in areas of the city, and then other entities, well, sure, Joel's here too, other entities tie into that fiber.
So our community area network, you'll referred to as a CAN sometimes. Other communities have them out there too.
We originally put it in 2009 to connect all the city buildings to each other to use common resources like a single phone system, a single server environment, a single internet connection, the things that we otherwise had 9 of, because there's generally actually more now, sites where we employ people. Since then, it's expanded to connect all of the Stevens Point Area School District buildings to each other so they can do the same thing. Portage County uses it, Mid-State uses it, we connect up with the university, so it's those kind of community anchor institutions that use it.
Think of it as roads for data.
And that's relatively new to that.
2009.
2009, yeah.
Thank you.
Growing every year, yeah. Yep.
Any other questions? Thank you so much. I suppose we could have a motion just to accept it and put it on file?
Nope,
No?
no action.
No action
Says
at
so
all.
right on the agenda.
All right, no action. Thank you for the information.
All right, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to present virtually. We do appreciate that as well. So have a great evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, then that brings us to our next item on the agenda. That'll be an update on the 2024 budget. Corey, I'm sure you'll probably be sharing the information with us.
Yes, so included in your packet was a fairly lengthy memo. It's a little bit complicated. A lot is going on, of course, as we prepare for the 2024 budget. But a couple of things that I really wanted to highlight. I guess I want to focus on the items that we're specifically looking for feedback on from the council. And the first is, I know I've mentioned it, the mayor's talked about it several times, about prioritizing employee compensation for the 2024 budget. As you know, we did get an increase in shared revenue of $865,000. That sounds like a lot of money, but it is only 3.2% of our $27 million operating budget. So one of the things that I think we just want to make sure that we're on the same page on is, okay, how do we use that money? How do we prioritize those resources? We've talked internally with the departments as well, and the issue that rises to the surface is employee compensation. So I don't necessarily need feedback on that today, but for sure for August, I would like some, formal feedback from finance and council just to make sure that, okay, we're all kind of paddling the canoe in the same direction.
Basically, that we're all still on the same page with the compensation priority.
Yep. Then the next piece is for the 2024 budget, we don't have a very good net new construction number. And net new construction is the overall growth in property tax value due to new construction. And that's what sets our levy limit in terms of the amount that we can adjust, the total amount that we collect in property taxes for operations. So with that number expected to be lower, probably around 1.5%, that's really not enough to account for inflation. So now luckily though, for 2024, we have the money in shared revenue, so we should be okay budget-wise, thank goodness for the increase in shared revenue. But it looks like we're facing something fairly similar for 2025 as well, in terms of a lighter year for net new construction, which means that there's a big concern for the 2025 budget, because if we only are able to increase our property tax levy for operations by 1 to 1.5%, that really doesn't allow us to account for current inflation. It doesn't allow us to really provide a cost of living adjustment to our employees that's meaningful, especially since we already have union contracts settled for 2.5% and 3%. So what can happen then is, all the money kind of goes to the represented employees because there's a legal obligation there with their union contract, and then there's nothing left over for the rest of the employees. That is something that's happened in the past. It has not happened recently, but it's also something that we don't want to have happen, especially with how competitive the labor market is. So what we would propose is that net new construction adjustment for 2024, taking that and rolling that over to 2025, which we're allowed to do under the levy limit statute. There's no penalties for doing that. We don't lose anything by doing that. And then basically for 2025 then, we put those two numbers together and we can have a reasonable 2.5% or 3% adjustment in the property tax levy for operations. And basically, the big picture is then that shared revenue increase, because we've planned ahead and planned kind of 2 years at a time. We've gotten through the 2024 and 2025 budgets, which without that shared revenue increase would have been, difficult budgets. So that is something that, if there's one really strong recommendation that I have, that's one really strong recommendation that I do have, because we obviously don't want a bad budget for 2025. Then the next logical decision that we're going to have to make is what we want to do with the total tax levy for the 2024 budget. The council in the past has given us the direction of keeping tax levy adjustments to 2.5% per year. Now, of course, this is a revaluation year. Everyone has a new assessment, and there may be some fairly significant adjustments related to that reassessment, where people may see tax bills be significantly different from what they have been in the past. So one option that we would have is to completely pass on making an adjustment in the total tax levy. So basically allowing the tax rate to go down, and collecting the exact same money in tax revenue for the 2024 budget as what we collected for the 2023 budget. That it's an option. Unfortunately, it's not going to solve everything in terms of the impacts of the reassessment, but it is a nice gesture. I think it'd be a nice thing to do. It helps a little bit. I can't say that it helps a lot, but it would help a little bit.
In terms of that, we're only one out of the 4 taxing entities, and so we only control one piece of that puzzle. We will be seeing an increase in the county portion. Will this be the first year that the levy for the healthcare center would come on board or not?
No, that should have been last year.
Should have been last year.
Did they start levying already last year?
They did, yeah.
Okay.
So we won't know what any of the other taxing entities are going to do until later this year.
Right. I think we do have kind of a unique opportunity to hold the line, because we do have the shared revenue dollars, and I think we would be prudent to do that, to try to limit the amount of impact, at least our portion that we can control. If we keep the dollar amount steady, the portion that we can control will actually help then, and the other entities can do the best they can. So I guess I think that makes sense, Corey.
Okay, thanks. And then one piece of that as well is, then I think if we do that, if we decide to totally pass on that tax levy adjustment, and then maybe at some point in the future we can look at that annual 2.5% adjustment as well to figure out, okay, what really is an appropriate number, just because we do want to make sure that we have enough money to fund capital projects going forward. But certainly I think that if there's a year where people could really use some help with the adjustment in taxes, it's going to be this coming year. So basically, those are the 3 things that we're looking for feedback from the council on. If not this month, next month would be prioritizing employee compensation as the use for any budgetary flexibility, rolling over the operating property tax levy limit adjustment to the 2025 budget so that we shore up the 2025 budget, and then what we want to do with the total tax levy for the 2024 budget.
Thoughts from the committee? Nothing else. Like I said, this is kind of the first look at it, and he's going to be asking for more concrete direction, but just in general, what are the committee's thoughts?
I would agree with older Christensen, because I know from talking to my neighbors, the assessments have come out, and some of those are pretty startling. And I mean, in a way, it's good. Their house values are going up. which is good, but so that also means that their taxes are going to go up too.
Right.
And with the rate of inflation and so on, I think if we're able to do that, I think that would be a good idea.
Well, and I think it's important for them to also understand that the percentage of increase in the assessment isn't going to result in that same percentage of increase in their taxes. And if we hold our dollar amount steady, their levy rate for the city will actually decrease. So they'll be paying the same number of dollars towards the city as they have been. Well, on the average. I mean, there'll be some that'll be less, some that'll stay the same, depending on whether or not their house, the amount of increase in value, if that percentage was higher than average, they're still going to see an increase for even in their city portion. If their amount of increase in value was less than percentage of what the average house did, they might actually see a slight decrease in dollars going towards the city. Alder Shore.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, I have a number of comments and questions, but why don't I just start focusing on just what you were saying about the reassessment. From what I understand, the reassessment takes place in the context of just reapportioning how much of a total that's the same, right? So if someone has the average increase, there's no change. So I think it would be helpful to know if there are any trends, to know about categories where the increase in value was the greatest, because I think that will tell us something about maybe where that pain is felt. So that'd be good to know. Why don't I pause there? I do have some other questions.
So the open book was done just today, so none of the numbers are finalized yet.
Right.
But I would expect that you could use 52, 53% as a good ballpark for the average increase in property values. The values, of course, go up, but then the mill rate will be adjusted accordingly.
Right.
So about 52%.
I think I'm asking, like, who's going to feel it because they had the biggest increase?
The ones over 52%.
If your increase went up
Right,
more than 52, you're probably going to see, yeah.
Right, that's the pure math of it.
Right.
But are there price categories, or is there any trends in the real estate that will tell us anything?
Gotcha.
Yes, and I do, it looks like residential, and Director Konoski can probably speak to this as well, but it looks like residential is the one that's appreciated by the greatest percentage.
Very accurate. So our commercial numbers have always, over the last few years, stayed relatively stable, somewhere between 80 and 90%. Our residential is the one that was really low, and that's why the state required that we go through the revaluation. The properties that we're seeing the most increase on, I'll say, are typically our older starter homes. May have been assessed anywhere from $70,000 to maybe $120,000, and now they're in the $150,000 to $220,000 range. Those is where we saw the highest increase. The homes, I'll say at the higher end of the point market, $250,000 plus. Didn't see as much of an increase. What I can tell you is that we have people who have acquired homes in Stevens Point in the last 5 years are not surprised. They've been a part of the market. Those who have owned their home for 20 plus years, who haven't seen the significant increases, may have bought their home on the north side for $70,000 in the late 90s, are the ones who are seeing the largest increase. Partially because they haven't been a part of the housing market locally here, but because that's where we're seeing a lot of the demand. A lot of our starter homes, a lot of our older homes in the community have really increased in fair market value, and that's where you're seeing a lot of the increases. The average increase is 52%. A good rule of thumb, I think, right now is if you're over probably 40% in increase in your assessed value, it's assumed that you'll see a slight increase in your property taxes.
I mean, that strengthens the case for that relief. What might be impossible to tell us is how far that revenue sharing goes, right?
And it's
I'll just,
premature yet, yeah.
kind of join the consensus that taking care of our workforce from, how they've been hit by inflation is a priority. But we've also heard from senior staff about how inflation has also affected costs of their other expenses. So I guess stay tuned. We'll be hearing more about how, how that's going to add up. But my final comment is about the position that all local governments are in. I'm sorry to hear about the ruling about transportation utility. It takes an option away from us. But revenue sharing's gone down, down, down. The state legislature's taken a lot of credit for reducing taxes at our expense, and making us the bad guys. And I just kind of say that to keep sight of it. So I understand why your recommendation about the levy increase in terms of postponing, taking what we can. But like I say, we're hearing $800,000, not in context yet, right?
Right. Any other comments by the committee? Anyone from the public? Okay. Then I think we're ready for our next item on the agenda. Scrolling back up.
Number 4.
All right. We do have discussion and possible action. Item number 4, approval of updated resolution designating a public depository and authorizing withdrawal of city monies.
Yes, so this is a document that we do update from time to time. Basically, the purpose is to designate which financial institutions we're authorized to do business with. So I have one just routine update, which is that Investors Community Bank was bought out by Nicolet National Bank, so updated that on the depository resolution, and then proposing to add 2 other financial institutions that have competitive rates that we may want to do business with in the future. One of them is Summit Credit Union, the other is First Business Bank. So, and the other thing to note about when we do business with any of these institutions is we do typically get some kind of secondary security or collateral as well, so that because we're often way above the FDIC insurance limit, so we do make sure that we protect, those taxpayer dollars from bank failure, even though that is, not very common. It's still, it has happened, and it's something that obviously we want to avoid any exposure to that potential risk.
Is there a motion to approve the resolution?
Question.
Oh,
Just
question.
Central City Credit Union is Simplicity, right?
Oh, my apologies. I will get that updated, so.
Can you please repeat that?
Central City Credit Union is Simplicity Credit Union.
Okay. So is there a motion to approve the resolution with that change?
So moved.
Alder Morrow, motion. Second? Alder Shuda?
Is there a second?
Okay. Any further discussion by the committee? Any from the public? Okay. Then all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed would be no.
What was that?
Chris, we're still on finance. We're not quite on public works yet.
Opposed would be no. Hearing none, that resolution is passed. That takes us to item number 5, consideration of a claim. Mitchell Martin.
Yes, so this situation is an individual had an unfortunate fall off of a swing at a city park. Claim is for $10,000. And basically, under Wisconsin statute, we do have what's called recreational immunity, which means if you're engaged in any kind of a recreational activity and it's provided at no cost, that the city does not have any liability for anything that might happen to you while you're participating in that. So our insurance company did review it, and swinging on a swing does qualify under the recreational immunity statute, so the recommendation is to deny the claim.
Is the claimant here?
Doesn't look like it. Okay, resolution, or motion to deny the claim would be so moved by Alder Shore. Is there a second? Alder Zarazua. Thoughts, Mayor?
Just a quick comment. With regards to anything that would fall under recreational immunity, if we are made aware of a problem, we address it immediately.
Right.
It's a big city. There are things that go unnoticed for a while, and accidents can happen. But anytime that there is any sort of issue that the city's made aware of, we do our best to address it immediately so it's taken care of. We don't want to have unsafe equipment or paths, or we're re-asphalting a bump that was in one of the bike lane or bike paths in one of the parks. We address it as soon as we possibly can.
Duly noted. Any comments from the public? Okay, we have a motion and a second. All of those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? And that is denied. Finally, we have, we have a couple things after. We have one other consideration of a claim.
Yes, so this is related to an individual who was parking at Mead Park and struck the parking block, and there was a piece of metal sticking out and it peeled off his bumper. We sent it into our insurance company. They reviewed it. They basically did recommend denial based on us meeting the standard of reasonable care that we do, inspect our parking lots and correct issues if we see them, and also that we'd be immune from liability under discretionary immunity, and that basically the extent to which we maintain our parking lots would be a discretionary decision for which we'd have immunity from liability over. So kind of like the mayor said, does not mean that we don't still want to address it. We let the Parks Department know right away so that they could correct this issue, but the is to deny the claim.
What are your wishes?
So moved.
So moved to deny. Is there a second?
I second.
Second by Morrow. Comments? Comments from the public?
Is this, yeah.
Is Brian Schilcher here? Once, twice?
Guess not. Any comments from the public? The denial, the approval of the denial by
Oh, an authorization for denial.
authorization to deny would be signified by saying aye. All those in favor of denying, say aye.
Aye.
And opposed would be no. That claim is also denied. Finally, we have approval of claims paid. Any questions, any specific items? And just a reminder too, if you do have questions on specific items, a lot of times if you call ahead of time, that can be cleared up pretty quickly. But if you do have any that come to the forefront that you have any questions on, otherwise a motion to approve the claims as paid would be in order.
Motion to approve the claims.
Motion by Morrow. Is there a second?
No second.
Second by Zarazua. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? It passes. Our agenda is exhausted, and we adjourn at 7:28.
A video of this meeting is available for viewing on the city's website, stevenspoint.com/videos.